Hello, my name's Natalie, and in this video I'll be discussing the film Women Talking. I'm going to be talking about it in depth, so there will be a lot of spoilers. And I also want to give a strong content warning that in this video I will be discussing sexual assault and rape. I've just been to see this film and it was so moving. The subject matter is pretty horrible. It's about the continual drugging and rape of women and girls in a religious colony. The women were gaslit into believing that the attacks were caused by the devil or ghosts or their own hysteria. But when one of the men is caught in the act, the women go berserk, understandably, and the man spills the beans on other men who have also been doing these crimes. The men go to jail for their own safety, and the rest of the colony's men go to town to organise bail for these ones who have been arrested. The women have about 2 days to decide what they're going to do with this information and how they're going to move forward in their lives, basically. And that's kind of what this film is about. The beauty of this film is that it allows space for the women to talk. They are taking their time processing things and coming to conclusions. The women aren't rushed, they aren't influenced, they simply know the facts at hand. They're kind of rationally and clearly working their way through each potential outcome. It physically shows the metacognition taking place, which is thinking about thinking and how different lines of thought will lead to different outcomes, which I find personally quite interesting. They initially end up with 3 options: do nothing, stay and fight, or leave. They try to go through the pros and cons of each option, but early on they decide they can't do nothing. They realise that their priority is to feel safe in their homes and in their community, and doing nothing won't enable that. Doing nothing enables the attacks to continue, but one of their concerns is around whether or not their souls will be saved if they don't forgive the men, and doesn't forgiving the men mean staying? I just want to take a moment to discuss, I guess, the interesting point that forgiveness is often seen as the victim survivor's responsibility. You know, she is the one that has to atone for the violence that has occurred against her. She is the one who needs to be moving on. The men haven't admitted what they've done, they haven't apologized. I mean, the ones who have gone to jail are being set free by the rest of the men in the colony, which just shows how little they value the safety of their women and children. It feels like women are so often the ones being expected to atone for violent crime. They're the ones going to the police telling them they were raped. They're the ones being medically examined and being photographed. They're the ones who are being asked how much they drank, or if they did drugs, or if they were wearing provocative clothing, and if they said yes at one point in the evening. And with all these kind of questions and attacks, it's like being re-traumatized all over again. Women are made to revisit and examine their trauma in such excruciating detail that if they say 2 things that don't quite match up, you know, the whole thing will be thrown out because they're lying, obviously. Attackers seem to suffer very little consequence, and then women are expected to forgive. One of the women says that perhaps forgiveness is mistaken for permission. And it's such a powerful statement because it's saying that just because it's been forgiven, it doesn't mean you have to pretend that it never happened. And just because someone is forgiven, it doesn't mean they get to do it again. It's clarifying that the action that happened was not permissible and it shouldn't happen again. These women aren't able to read, they're not given any education, and they hardly know anything about what happens in the communities just outside the borders of their colony. So a lot of their thinking is shaped by what men say, and particularly the elders of the religious group say. Their critical thinking skills are certainly there, but they don't seem to have fully explored their place in the world or interrogated their desire to be part of this community, which is the only home they've ever known, so reasonable enough. The film takes a sympathetic look at these women. It's okay that they've stayed, and it's okay that they want to continue to stay. The colony is their family, it's their lifestyle and livelihood, it's their mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, daughters and sons. There's nothing wrong with being part of that. As an outsider looking in, it can be easy to imagine what happens in these communities and condemn them for the oppression of women. But this film doesn't do that. It allows them to come to terms with their own suffering and realize that the way they think has been shaped by their leaders and that perhaps their leaders aren't doing a good job. They talk about power, who has it and whether or not they want access to it. They pass through the idea of having a voice, being able to participate in leadership, being educated. They realize that the lack of these things for women in their community is part of the reason why this violence has been allowed to occur. The women don't want power to fulfill their own ambition. They want power so that they can be safe and to provide safety for their children. They realize that they need to have power equal to that of a man in order to create that safety. This is why it's so important to encourage power in our families, in our communities, and to a broader extent in our countries. It's an encouragement to vote, to hold leaders accountable for what kind of culture they're helping to develop, and also to see whether it serves all people with justice and fairness. The women recognize that in that environment where a select few men are the ones dictating the rules and the reasons, where boys are educated in a culture that allows them to inflict violence on one another, there is no chance for forgiveness to happen. What needs to happen is that the women find safety and freedom, and they realize they're going to have to find that elsewhere in order for their forgiveness and healing work to begin. A mother whose 4-year-old daughter was raped is completely incandescent with rage, and rightfully so. She admits that she will murder the perpetrator. She does this brilliant monologue about desecrating the bodies, letting them burn, and burying them alive. She won't be able to help herself. I love how the response of the other woman is to acknowledge her rage. Rather than ask her to switch it off or tell her to just let it go and forgive, they allow the rage to fuel her and them, and they realize that this means they have to leave. She doesn't have to change, and nor should she. But in order to prevent her from becoming a murderer and to save her soul, they decide to rescue her from it, to help her free herself from the violence and respond in a faith-filled way. Their faith is so strong because they hope to be free from violence, not only violence that they commit themselves or may commit themselves, but to create an environment where the men are no longer committing violence as well. Women are so often called hysterical and told that we're crazy and that we need to be protected from ourselves, that we aren't fit to make hard choices or be in leadership. Yet this film shows a beautiful example of the power and rationality of women. If the tables were turned, a man would be encouraged to gather his weapons and hunt the attacker down. His desire for revenge would be perfectly justified, and his rage would be a given. When dealt the worst possible hand, or even just simply rejected by a crush, men seem to go ballistic. On the other hand, women talk and organize and care for their communities. The women wrestle with forgiveness and seek ways to minimize harm and prevent more violence from happening, whether by the perpetrator or by the victim survivors. Women are not hysterical. They're justifiably angry and fed up with how they've been treated. They're suffering things that are real, violent acts that are inflicted upon them, not by the devil, not by ghosts, not by their imagination, but by mostly men. It's a really moving sequence that I interpreted as a sort of transition in faith. They're not turning away from God or rejecting their belief system, but they're amalgamating their experiences and choices with Scripture in order to create a new way of believing and a new way of relating to God. They use their faith to uphold them and to connect them together. I think a lot of people are trying to reconcile their faith with their experiences these days, and kind of try to understand how faith-based organizations can be so toxic and harmful and behave like the antithesis of what they espouse. What I love about this scene is that the women acknowledge that perhaps their faith was skewed, perhaps their leaders weren't leading them down the right path, and maybe there's an alternative way to commune with God, or at least remain safe and protected while doing so. One of the women talks about moving away from the violence and walking forwards and forwards and forwards and forwards and just moving on from it. And It's a beautiful picture because she's allowing time to remove her from the violence metaphorically, but also allowing her physical actions to also move her away from the violence physically. She eventually sees that leaving the colony is really the only option the women have in order to process the violence and come to a place of possibly healing and possible forgiveness and even possible love for their attackers. I think the overall gut-wrenching feeling of watching this film comes from the question of whether or not these women are going to be able to escape their attackers or not. The constant desire for these women to seek reconciliation, to seek faith, to uphold their community values was kind of at odds with their desire and need for safety and protection. Some women are visibly sympathetic for the men, and it just made me think of all the times victims are accused of not having left earlier when they should, or staying with a partner who may be violent towards them. The whole situation could just be so complicated. The film empathizes with people being abused because it shows just how truly confusing it is to love someone and to be part of a community with someone who is also violent towards you and not really knowing what to do about it. Overall, I think this film is really good at showcasing social conditioning. You know, the environment that we live in often determines how people act, and it clearly uses patriarchy as its example. Within the framework of this patriarchy, the boys are raised to believe that they're leaders. They're raised to believe that they are the ones who are capable of interpreting the gospel. They also learn that they are able to control the women in their community and that nothing can or will stop them from unleashing the full wrath of their physical desires on them. They create drugs, they gaslight the women, they form male bonds around these attacks, and they simply don't care because they have power. Unfortunately, it's not a stretch of the imagination to see this happening in the real world, and this film is based on a true story. The journalist who initially wrote the story about this community went back since and has reported that unfortunately the crimes and the abuse is still happening. So yes, this is a powerful film, not only for the way it processes the attacks and does so with a focus on a peaceful outcome, it's also a quiet reminder that we need to change the culture we live in and speak up when we see or experience misogyny happening. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you got something out of it, please leave a like or subscribe to my channel. That would be super helpful. Otherwise, I have this video here on the male gaze in The Fast and the Furious, which you might enjoy, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.